with universal common descent is what we're looking at now, is that people can't explain. There is no mechanism. How do you, well, it just happens. It just occurs. They point to the fossil record. They point to the fact that there must be an ancestor. They point to the fact that these things must be so, therefore they are so. But we could, again, we have an issue with that because how do you, okay, you're saying it must be, now prove it. But they can't. And he mentioned fish heads. A lot of times they'll point to that. They'll point to whales, the evolution of whales, and they'll point to some stuff we're gonna look at tonight. They say, well, look at the similarities, therefore it must prove it so. But similarity doesn't always mean that they're connected the same way. And we'll talk about that, especially specifically with similarity between us and apes. But right now we'll look at universal common descent. So that's the idea that not only do certain things have a common descent, let's say dogs and wolves have that common descent from a canine ancestor, but that all things had a common descent from one kind of ancestor. And because of that, we have leftover parts of ourselves that are very similar at the very small stages when we start to form, because we're forming at our most simple. And because we're at our most simple, we are most similar. And so this is, what's his name? Ernest Haeckel, in his infamous, I'd say, embryo drawings. And so he made these drawings, and people still have them in textbooks, and people still point to them today. You'll see them all over. Right here is a fish. You have a salamander, for those who can't see it. A fish, a salamander, a tortoise, a chick, a hog, a calf, a rabbit, and a human. And you'll notice at the early stages, they look almost identical. And then the middle stages, they start to become a little bit more different. And at the end, they become a little bit more different. You see the mammals look very similar in terms of the way they're formed. And so because of that, a lot of people looked at this and say, look, this proves evolution because we are so similar to our base form. And then we become a little bit different because, you know, over time we've changed into something different, but we all have the same base pattern, and we can see how we can all change into something so similar and then become something so complexly different. Of course, the issue is just because it's similar doesn't necessarily mean it's connected. Again, we looked at a tapir and an elephant. They have similar kinds of things with their little snouts, but just because they're similar doesn't mean they're connected. They are very, very vastly apart, not very closely related at all, scientists would say. And so well, how do we explain this? That's the question. Well, they look very similar, and they look like they'd be related. I mean, they almost look identical. How could you tell them apart? And so these are actual photographs looking at the embryos within their mothers. And so over here you have a lamprey, a dogfish, a gar, salmon, lungfish, axolotl, hellbender, snake, chicken, possum, cat, bat, and human at the end there. These are what they actually look like. This is the base embryo. If you notice the difference, this is what he said, that's the earliest stage right there. That's very different. Those don't look anything alike. I mean, some of those, I mean, maybe, you got this little thing going on here, but even that, the shapes are kind of different. There's a lot of stuff going on that's different that we see there. Of course, they're very simple. I mean, how much can you make with something so simple? But yet they're not even close to being as similar as they show here. And then as you start to get farther down, you'll notice a lot more differences than that. And this was M.K. Richard and his staff's embryo photographs. One of the things to note later on is that people found out that these are drawings, by the way, obviously. So that's one thing. You'll notice how he draws them similarly. That human looks awfully animalistic compared to the other two, but that's just a drawing. So it makes you, I mean, it looks close enough. As a drawing, you wouldn't see anything different with it. As a photograph, you'd say that looks a bit like in the uncanny valley, that kind of area. So one of the issues they found is he cherry-picked which ones he took in which part. So he cherry-picked which animals he used. He also cherry-picked which part. This is not the earliest part, and nor is it the same part in each animal. This part may become earlier for a chick than it comes for a hog, but he just picks all the stages that look similar and then makes them look similar. They don't even look that similar, as we've seen with some of these. So he cherry-picked those and he drew them out, and that's where we get a lot of those issues from. But people still point to that one, but it's been disproven, even though people try to say again, this same thing we saw with the abiogenesis thing, that those experiments where people just say, look, it just proves it. It's been disproven, but they just kind of sweep that under the rug. They say, well, it's possible at least. But what do we do with some of the issues where we find those similarities? Because there are parts of like birds, reptiles, humans, and fish. Some of them have these kind of similar parts. We do look kind of similar at certain stages. Not exactly as similar as he made it out to be, but they seem to be very similar. In fact, we all seem to have gill slits. How do we explain that? How do we deal with this? That seems to prove universal common descent. But it's actually kind of easy. So you'll look. One thing to note, these aren't gill slits. They're just little storage areas. They call them phalangeal arches, I believe is what they're called. And you'll notice there's different pieces in them that are not going to form gill slits. You come down here, and you see it starts to form parts of the jaw, and parts of the neck, and parts of the throat. That's not the same as gills. And you see it as it comes over here and starts the musculature and all this stuff. Basically, all this is just storage for the material that will later form the rest of that lower part of your jaw and some of your face. That has a lot of with your ear and all the inner ear and outer ear, all that kind of stuff. That has nothing to do with gills, not even close. Not to mention that reptiles don't have gills. It's just this, when embryos are really small, there's not a lot of space, and they're kind of formed over themselves. And so they have all these wrinkles and crunches and kind of stuff. And that's just, that's where they roll over like this, and all that stuff kind of forms there, and it slowly forms outward. So it is similar in terms of the storage, but it's not similar at all in terms of what they have inside that kind of storage. And so, let's see, this is a quote from a scientist who was looking into this. It says, humans never have gills, and our gill slits don't normally open up the way that fish gill slits do. But we definitely do have the same basic structures, the pharyngeal arches that go on to form gills in fish. Again, mentioning we have that same storage stuff that goes on to form gills. So this person was trying to prove that they're similar, saying that, yeah, the storage structures are similar, therefore we are similar. But obviously we can see that we're not. There's another quote, I won't read through all of it, but basically they say all the evolutionary changes that would lead, just in this stuff alone, and say, well, look, evolution made it so different, especially when it comes to embryos, that it almost looks like we're not similar at all, is basically what it sums up to. And he says this: these modifications of embryonic development are difficult to reconcile with the idea that most or all vertebrate clades pass through an embryonic stage that is highly resistant to evolutionary change. This idea is implicit in Haeckel's drawings, which have been used to substantiate two distinct claims. First, that differences between species typically become more apparent at later stages, which has been proven. We can see that. Obviously, they're different at later stages. We looked at how different they are. And the second claim, that vertebrate embryos are virtually identical at early stages. Basically, Haeckel and many people who came after him said, well, the embryos must be the same, not only later on, but definitely early on. But they aren't. What we actually find is that they are not even close. In fact, they're so different that we'd actually think that they're not even from the same ancestor. Says it does not support the second claim and instead reveals considerable variability, which makes it difficult to explain that with evolution. It actually looks like it's proving the opposite, but people, again, still point to this. One thing I would note, and we'll get to this a little bit later, we should expect to see some things in common, and we do see that with mammals in particular, and even with reptiles and fish. We have skeletal structures. We have some sort of skin. We have some sort of eyes. We have something to breathe with. We see a lot of similarities there. Why do we see a lot of similarities there? Well, one thing to note is that God made limitations within this universe, and based on those limitations, we can only do certain things. We have air to breathe. Well, we don't have other stuff that we can breathe, so we have to breathe air, so we have to develop things that can breathe that air. That's a limitation. We have gravity. Well, that creates a limitation. We can only be so tall, only can grow certain ways. Pressure in the ocean, so we should expect to see a lot of similarities there because we're all dealing with a lot of similar pressures. Another thing to note is that we have the same creator creating these designs. Well, one thing you know with human beings, we create a lot of things that have a lot of similarities because we're the same person. I create this thing, I create this other thing. Well, they look kind of similar. Well, yeah, I'm still me. And we see that, I think we see that with God, where he uses some of, just one kind of blueprint idea, and he makes things similar to that, but they're not related. It's just I want to make something that has bones and skin and fat and tissue and muscles, and then I make it this way and I'll make it this way. They're vastly different, but they have those similar basic structures. There's nothing wrong with that. Another thing to point out, when people say, well, macroevolution must be true because vestigial structures. We must have universal common descent because these things prove that something before us had these things that made sense. Now they don't make sense anymore. This is a snake. I forget which kind it was. But it has what they call reduced hind legs. Within it, it has these little protrusions that come out at the bottom of the snake. They're not completely flat underneath. And so snakes have these little things, right where their pelvic area would be. Basically, if it was a lizard, that's where its hind legs would be. But it doesn't have hind legs, and it's not a lizard. So how do we explain this? Why does it have reduced hind legs? What's the purpose of those? I mean, you can't crawl with that. You're not going to go anywhere. Another thing we see is the vestigial pelvis, and this is in whales. Well, whales don't have back legs. Why in the world does it have a pelvis? Well, because it used to have back legs when it was a mammal, and then it slowly turned into a whale, and it lost all that kind of stuff. This must be leftover kinds of things. The issue with that is that's not true. So people will still point to this today and say this is how it is, and this is why it is. But for instance, these don't serve no purpose. And a lot of times they'll look at vestigial structures and say, well, they serve no purpose. They're just left over. They're trash. They're garbage that's left over inside your body or inside the body of animals. But these are very important, both for snakes and for whales, because there's something that happens with these creatures. In order to reproduce, they need to have some structure there. Because if they didn't, they flop around and they wouldn't be able to reproduce. In order to mate, they have to have something that has some rigidness to it for those muscles to connect to. And they need those muscles to connect to those parts so they can reproduce. If not, everything's flopping around. Because your fat in your skin and your muscle, it just goes nowhere. It doesn't do anything. It needs to have something strong to carry it to, connect it to. And so that's what it's for. It's for mating, it's for breeding, and it's for giving birth. Well, that doesn't sound vestigial to me. That doesn't sound like garbage. That doesn't sound like leftover material. That sounds like it's very much necessary, which it is. That's why they still have it, because they need it. It's almost like they've always had it. One thing they'll point out with human beings in particular is the tailbone. That's the coccyx right there. They'll say, well, the tailbone is a leftover from when we used to be more like ape-like ancestors. We used to have our tails. How do we explain this one? I mean, it seems like, and you actually see with certain humans, they'll have extra bones back there and they'll have extra fatty tissue, and it looks like they have a tail. Well, that seems like because we used to have a tail. Actually, if you'll notice, so this is the pelvic bone. This is where your two legs connect. This is the little opening in the middle, so you can see, like, this is how it stands. You're looking at it kind of a little bird's eye view a little bit. So this is the front, this is the back. If you can think on your body, what's something that happens back here that it's very important that you have after you eat something? When you eat, you have to use the restroom soon afterwards. If we didn't have the tailbone, we would just use the restroom whenever our body wanted to, because it would just expel it out. Why? Because that's where our anus is. Basically, that's the part where your muscles connect to able to hold stuff from coming out. That's the best way to explain it. That's very much necessary. I wouldn't say that's vestigial at all. It's not a tailbone, even though we call it tailbone. It's the part that connects to the lower end of your butt. If we didn't have that, it just goes everywhere. You can't do anything about it. It's loose over there. You don't really want that. Bad stuff comes in, bad stuff goes out. It's not unnecessary. It's very much necessary. It has nothing to do with the tail. It's not even connected to the part of the spine or anything like that. It doesn't have all that kind of musculature. It just has the muscles connecting to it and the tendons connecting to it so you can use the bathroom. That's what it's made for. Again, not vestigial. That also kind of ties in with things like you'll hear, the appendix. They'll say, oh, the appendix is unnecessary. Well, the appendix makes good and healthy and strong microbes that help with your gut health. You need those things to process food and break it down, all that kind of stuff, and make sure you're not to deal with all the bad stuff that comes into your body with all your good stuff that you're eating. That's not unnecessary. However, you can live without your appendix. People's appendix burst or it's getting close to bursting, they remove it. You can live without it because you have other things that create microbes and stuff like that. You can also live without one kidney. I wouldn't say that one kidney is unnecessary. Oh, we have two kidneys. Well, one's unnecessary. Just get rid of it, sell it. You can make a lot of money off a kidney. I think everybody would do that. But it's not unnecessary. Just because you can live without something does not make it unnecessary. You can live without two legs. That does not make it unnecessary. There's a lot of people who are amputees who would say, I think it is very much necessary. I would love to have that. Even though I can live without it, I'm still alive, I'm still breathing, I'm still surviving. I'm not thriving, I don't know. I would like to have that thing, because just because you can live without it does not mean you don't necessarily, I mean, we could live without eyes and a nose and a mouth and ears, and somehow we have like tubes inside of us and we're just alive. But we wouldn't say those things are unnecessary. They're very much necessary. So we don't actually have vestigial structures. We'll talk about things like with our ears, how you wiggle your ears. Well, that's not necessary, but it used to be necessary. We had big ears, all that kind of stuff. You do need those kind of aspects. It kind of ties in with your jaw and all that kind of, all that. It's really interesting to look at the things that they think were left over. This is a goofy looking picture. This is Lucy. So Lucy is one of the biggest things. This is Lucy and Neanderthal. Those are kind of the biggest things that people point to in terms of evolution. Well, we know evolution is real because we came from evolutionary ancestors, and we've discovered these evolutionary ancestors. And so this is one of them. The most famous one, Lucy, Australopithecus. And so Lucy's name is also, she's also called Dinkinesh, which is Amharic, for you are marvelous. And so the Lucy fossil, and we'll look at the Lucy fossil next, is a collection of several hundred pieces of fossilized bone comprising 40% of the skeleton of a female of the hominid species, Australopithecus afarensis, discovered in 1974 in Ethiopia, and it's been dated to about 3.2 million years ago. And so here is the human-like recreation of Lucy. If we were to see that, we would say that looks like it could be our ancestor. That looks like it could be actually the ancestor of both us and apes, because it's very ape-like and yet it's very human-like. So how do we explain this? I mean, look, that looks very similar. I could see how I could come from that. I could see how we could come from that. Well, let's look at the actual fossil. Yeah, it makes you laugh. How in the world, how do they know that its lips are red? How do they know it has no fur over here but has a lot of fur over there? How do they know any of that kind of stuff? I mean, how do they know what's going on with their feet? It doesn't even have the feet. Or with their hands, they have one finger right there. Two parts, one part of the wrist and one part of the finger. That's all they have. But we know they have human-like hands. We know they have eyes that look very human-like, even though we don't even have the full skull. But we know it's human-like because it must be human-like. Here's another rendition, an ape-like recreation of using the exact same bones. It looks a lot like an ape because the parts that separate us the most are the parts that they're mostly missing. So a lot of people look at, and there's other kinds of apes that they've found, they're basically in the same boat as this. But the people look at this and they'll say, we know we came from ancestors because fossils prove it. Again, going back to fossils, we can't tell if it proves it or not because we have no idea if it proves it or not. In fact, the bones we found, what if this bone was a human bone and it just happened to go there? We have no idea. We don't know. So basically, and another thing with Lucy's, they found her near human-like footprints. And they say, well, then we know that she must have walked upright because she had human-like footprints. But they say that because they don't believe that humans could exist millions of years ago, because this must have been millions of years ago. So if you come at it with the idea that there must be ape-like ancestors, they must be walking like humans, and they must be upright, they must look like this, therefore they do. Even though the evidence doesn't point to that at all. That's what they'll make it point to. Basically, they're both based on assumptions. Whether it looked ape-like, whether it looked human-like, we don't know, because we have no idea what they looked like when they're alive. All we know is what it looks like as a fossil. And so here's a quote. It says, this is talking about Lucy's hands. Basically, these parts of the finger are very important when it comes to Lucy. So they've been noted to be relatively long and curved fingers, having relatively long arms and a funnel-shaped chest. That's the kind of stuff, based on the few bits of pieces we have, it's very similar to an ape. That funnel-shaped chest, those curled fingers. Apes don't actually have bones that go straight like ours in terms of their fingers. If you ever see like the movie Planet of the Apes, their hands are always like this because they roll and they walk like this. Their hands will never go straight perfectly because their bones are curved. The reason their bones are curved is because it makes it easier for them to roll them. That's very, very specific to apes, not in humans. And yet that's what Lucy has. With that little bone that we can see, that's what she has, a curved bone. Also, it says the conclusion is that Lucy's erect posture is unlike that seen in modern humans and is still a mystery. Not enough fossil data are yet available to make a final judgment on the nature of her erect posture. Prevailing views of Lucy's posture are almost impossible to reconcile. When one looks at the reconstruction proposed by Lovejoy and by Weaver, one gets the impression that her fleshed reconstruction would be perfectly modern biped. But when one looks at the preliminary reconstruction recently shown at the Smithsonian, one gets the impression of a chimpanzee awkwardly attempting to stand on its hind limbs and about to fall on its front limbs. To resolve such differences, more anatomical fossil evidence is needed. The available data at present are open to widely different interpretations. Until more fossils are recovered, until we have a better interpretation of human and non-human primate positional behavior, there is likely to be a continuing debate on the subject of Lucy's posture and locomotion. Lucy's erect posture is still is a mystery. Basically, again, just summarizing what I just said, we don't know. It actually looks more ape-like, but we think it must be human-like. And that's where the debate comes from. It must be human-like, even though everything it points to it to being ape-like. And that's where you have a lot of issues. It just doesn't work. But what about the big question, or the big issue with evidence? Chimps are 99% similar to humans in our DNA. I think a lot of people have heard this. It's actually 98.8%. Humans and chimps share a surprising 98.8% of their DNA. Human and chimp DNA is so similar because the two species are so closely related. That's the American Museum of Natural History. You'll find that all over the place. People quote this specific quote. Well, we're so similar, 98.8%. That means that the 2 or 1.2% difference is just the minor stuff we see. Maybe our intelligence and some stuff with that, the way our fingers are curved. That's the little bit of difference. Everything else, we're so closely related because we are the same, basically. However, so this is a guy, he went through, I'm just going to summarize his research, but he went through and look at the two genomes between humans and apes, and he found some issues. So 6.29% had no alignment to the chimp assembly. That's basically, when looking at the genomes, you have different genome structures and the different like letters A, G, that kind of stuff. And so you're trying to look at the way the DNA code is laid out. You try to figure out which ones are similar and which ones are different. And so they're trying to find those similarities. Can I find basically, like in code, you're going to find large areas of code that coincide together and parts that don't. 5.01% was in CNVs relative to chimp, let me see, which is the copy number variance. Basically, it just repeated itself. 1.11% differed due to SNPs in the one-to-one best-aligned regions. That would be the small sections of DNA, or that's where the few nucleotides differ. So there are some differences there. 0.28% differed due to indels with the one-to-one best-aligned regions. And that's the small sections of DNA that have been added or removed. Basically, within the genome, there are parts that we don't really understand, so we have to get rid of them. And so the percentage of nucleotides in the human genome that had one-to-one exact matches in the chimpanzee genome was 82.34%. That's still a lot, but that's a lot different than 98.8%. 82.34% actually explains a lot, because we look very similar to apes. In fact, we're a lot similar to apes because we have hair like apes do. We have, let me go back and we'll look at those apes. We can see the similarities. We have ears like apes. We have eyes like apes. We have our jaw structure, our skull structure is similar to apes. Our skeletal structure is similar to apes. Again, that word's similar. We have hands and feet with 5 fingers and 5 toes, similar to apes. We have teeth similar to apes. We have brains that are similar to apes in terms of the way they look. A lot of our anatomy is very similar to apes, but there's a lot of differences. In fact, there's so many differences, that's why it makes sense that we have 82 point whatever %. You'll notice with apes' feet are different than human feet. No matter how much, you can see Luciano, my nephew, oh, he's gone now. But he likes to grab things with his feet. And as good as he is, as strong as he is, he's not ever gonna be as good as a chimpanzee. Because an ape has the ability to, if you look, its main toe, which is more like a thumb, is much lower down than ours on our feet. Our feet like almost right next to each other. But with your hand, it's farther down, which makes it easier to grab things. Because now you have your fingers over here, your thumb over here, and they can grab things, which is almost like a chimpanzee foot. It's almost like they have 4 hands. That's a lot different. That's way different than ours. Again, those rolled fingers make it different than ours. Their arms are longer than ours, and their legs shorter, and their torso's longer. Their teeth, they have those sharp canines that we don't have. Their jaws can open up wider. Their noses are much wider. Their brains are vastly different than ours, much smaller and less capable, and various other differences. We would expect to see similarities because there are a lot of similarities. But we will, just like we see similarities with us and other mammals. Well, we have lungs, and cows have lungs, so we must be so similar, we're so related. Well, we have parts of our genome that have the same stuff for lungs, and they have parts in their genome for lungs, so we should expect to see similarities, but it does not prove that it's connected. We are similar, but so different. These are babies, by the way. This is a baby chimpanzee, this is a baby human. Do they look similar to you? A little bit, but not a lot, because in reality, we are vastly different. That almost 20% difference in genomes makes differences like this. And they are vastly different. You can think about when most animals actually are born, they're pretty much able to do a lot of stuff on their own, while babies take forever, which is fine. Everyone likes babies. We like babies, but they can't survive on their own. A lot of small animals can survive a long time on their own. Human babies, basically die. That's not funny, Brother Anthony. That's our pastor. Okay. The last thing we'll look at tonight. What about Neanderthals? And this is one thing that everybody looks at also. Well, we actually found human ancestors that are very similar to us. In fact, not only do we have fossil evidence, we seem to actually have preserved, partially frozen Neanderthals that we found. And they are so similar to humans, but we know they're different. And it's because they're different, we know that they had a similar ancestor to us. They actually don't think they're our ancestor, but they are a similar ancestor, and they kind of broke off. You had Neanderthal, and you had Homo sapiens, and then we kind of prevailed over them. But one of the interesting things we found with Neanderthals, we actually have a lot of archaeological evidence on Neanderthal. We found things like evidence that they made tools, had makeup, jewelry, and even made cave paintings. Basically, and there's more stuff than that, but basically we found that they are so human-like, not in terms of just the way they look, but in the way they acted and interacted with each other, the stuff they created, that if you actually saw the bone structure of a Neanderthal, or you saw a Neanderthal just like this, I'm sure people have actually seen someone like this, you would think they're human. I wonder why. It's almost like they are. One issue, again, going back to speciation, when you have different species, if we were to use that same kind of terminology with humans, we would say, well, you know, there's different species over there in Africa, and there's different species in Asia, and there's different, that sounds really racist, we would say. Well, yeah, that's horrible. But that's what we're doing with Neanderthal. Well, he has got a bigger forehead. I don't like that. And he's got a bigger nose. I don't like that. That's a different species. But no, we would say that he's just different variations of the human species. They're different a little bit, just like we're all different. I'm different than Nico. Nico's different than Brother Jason. Jason's different than Brother Sammy, which is different than Megan. We're all, even though Sammy and Megan are siblings, they're not the same. They're a little bit different because their facial structures are different. We see the same thing with Neanderthal. I have no idea why they think Neanderthal must be an ancestor, other than the fact that they believe they must be. Neanderthal must be an ancestor or must be an offshoot of humanity, even though everything points to them being exactly the same. For whatever reason, they say they're not. It's bizarre to me. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I don't think it makes any sense to anybody if you look into it. They are so similar, we would just say they're just people that look different. They have different stuff. It's just a predominant person that looks different. You think about people who are born in Asia, people who are predominantly Asian, they have different facial structures than we do. Or I should say we do. Some people might be Asian. But they have different facial structures than those people who are Caucasian. Why? Are there different species of human? No, they're the same, but they have structures that are vastly different than someone else with structures over here. And that's the same thing with Neanderthal. Basically, we would say he's, in our terms, we'd say he has different ethnicity or different race, but they're exactly the same. So now it comes down to this, what it's all been building up to. What does it all mean? Can the Bible and evolution live in harmony? Let's look at Colossians 2:8. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 8. And it says, beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. And I think as we looked at these different lessons, that's kind of what we've seen. Philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men. Again, a lot of this seems like it's tradition. Why are they their ancestors? Well, they must be. Because someone else said they must be, and someone else said they must be, and someone else said they must be. That's what we believe it must be. But is that true or not? There's that one verse, Romans 3:4, let God be true and every man a liar. We don't believe that verse because we want God to be true. I hope he is, and every man's a liar. No, it's because God has proven himself true, and men have proven ourselves as liars. And so you're going to trust God who's proven himself true 100% of the time, or man who's proven himself true some of the time. Well, I trust God. God says, this is how I created the world. I'm going to say, well, okay, I agree with it because you've proven this other thing. Therefore, because you've proven stuff like this, like the resurrection of Jesus Christ, therefore I'll believe what you did in the beginning of creation. The evidence proves the need for God as his mechanism. That's the biggest thing. The reason they can't coexist is because there is no mechanism with evolution. It falls apart. It doesn't work. Yet with God, there is a mechanism. That's intelligent design. It's the only viable option because intelligence is designed. It's the only reason we have intelligence. There's other things you can look into, like consciousness and stuff like that, that have no basis in our material world. How could material things or physical things make something that's metaphysical, like consciousness? It can't. How does that evolve over time? It can't. We just got it all of a sudden. Where? From where? From what? It doesn't make any sense unless you have an intelligence that creates that kind of intelligence. The last thing to ask is, what's the big deal? Because if it's just a theory, why do we care so much? Let them believe their theory. We'll believe our theory, and we just live like that. There are some issues with that. I don't know how many of you guys know this, but Joseph Stalin and Charles Darwin were both Christians who were going to school to become priests. That's how much they believed in what they thought about God. That God must be real, the Bible must be true, I'm going to become a priest. And yet both of them died atheists. Darwin kind of believed there could be an intelligence. He was more agnostic. But they both died disbelieving in the Christian God. Stalin is said to have shaken his fist towards the sky and to God before he died. And Stalin did a whole bunch of bad things. Why? Well, because God's not true. Evolution is true. And there's a lot of people like that now today who do a lot of bad things because they believe evolution is true. There's a lot of people who don't believe in God because evolution is true. There's a lot of, and we looked at some of that stuff with Darwin's theories and how it leads to like eugenics and things like that. If you believe that evolution is true, then you believe that God can't be true because God says evolution doesn't happen. And evolution says, yeah, well, it did. And then, well, which one I'm going to agree with? If you believe in evolution, you can't believe with God because they don't coexist as we've looked at these couple lessons, which leads to various issues. Let's look at 1 Peter 3, verse 15. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. And so there's a lot of people who believe this stuff and look at this stuff and they say, well, it must be true. And because it's true, therefore God doesn't exist. Therefore, I don't care about Jesus. I don't care about the Bible. I don't care about the commandments. I don't care about any of that kind of stuff because that stuff doesn't matter to me because that stuff doesn't apply because that stuff's not real. And you might say it's no big deal. A lot of people think it's no big deal. They think the world would be better off without any kind of religion. But that comes down to what is the truth. So 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15 says, But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. Why should we care? Well, one of the reasons we should care is because other people are falling to something that's not true. The other reason is because we should be able to share that hope that we have. With evolution, I brought this up before, there is no hope. You die. That's it. You live and you die. Your life is meaningless, and whatever meaning you gave to it, that's fine with you, but eventually people will forget you. You will fade away into history, and that's it. That's your existence. Your existence is meaningless. Some people look at that and they get depressed and they end up committing suicide. Other people look at that and they get nihilistic and they start thinking there's no reason to do anything. They're very cynical and their life is very horrible. Other people get crazy and they go, well, because life has no meaning, I'm going to do whatever I want and I'll get away with it because I can just die and nothing will happen to me. Therefore, I'll be fine. And there's a lot of people that look at life, and you saw that a lot during COVID, where they had no hope. Well, this is all there is. But we have a hope. And our hope is sure, not because we want it to be true, not because we believe it to be true, because it is true. God has proven it true. That's other stuff we can look at in terms of believing the Bible and all that kind of stuff, all the evidence that backs it up. But there must, like at least the stuff we looked at over these lessons, there must be a God that created us. And if there was a God that created us, the question we have to ask is, what does he want from us? And what is our life, what's our life's purpose? If he created us, he must know our purpose. That's the question we have to ask, and that's the question we have to ask other people. And that's why we show them this stuff, because that means this stuff proves, the evidence they think that proves evolution actually proves a creator God. And if it proves a creator God, then they have to ask the next question. What does that creator God want? What's our purpose in life? We looked at those 4 questions that shape our worldview. Who am I and what am I worth? Where am I going? And what can I hope? And that kind of stuff. This is why it's important. This is why we have to share this kind of stuff, because a lot of people say there is no hope, there is no reason, but there is hope, and there is reason with Christ. And that's very important, not just because it feels good, because it's true. And if it's true, that means there's a good place and there's a bad place. And wherever you go, it depends on your answer to this question, which is, what is the big deal? Why does it matter? Well, if you're going to the bad place, that's because you deserve to go there. If you're going to the good place, it's not because you deserve to go there, because someone paved a way for that. And so this stuff that we have to think about and stuff that we have to share. That's why this is so important, because people won't even look at the Bible. They won't even look at Christ sometimes because they look at evolution. If you can break down that barrier, at least you can get them to consider Christ. We can't force them to believe in Christ, of course. We don't want to do that. We want to show them that God is true, and because he's true, there's something that they must answer for. There's something that they must do because of that.